Greetings and welcome. Happy Wednesday also. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Milo Primo. I use he, him pronouns or they, them. I'm the founder, CEO of Just Roots Consulting, which is a firm that works with organizations and employers to increase their capacity to do better with equity and inclusion and diversity efforts within their organizations, and also with the people that they serve and the customers and clients they work with. I am a queer trans person. I'm also a civil rights attorney licensed in the state of New York. And in my spare time, I'm also an Icelandic sheep farmer. So if you want to ask me more about that later, please feel free to do so. But today, we're going to be focusing on one thing that we're going to talk about, and this is the second in a series of webinars, focusing specifically on working with and managing trans people in the workplace. So many of you, I think, joined us for the webinar last week where we laid a foundation around language and concepts so that everybody was on the same page about what it means to be trans. So we will not be covering that part of it today. If you missed that part and you would like to see that later, we will be uploading that webinar, the recorded version, online as soon as possible. But today we're going to jump right into the meat and potatoes of it. So come along with us for that ride. And I will also say that throughout this presentation, if anybody has any questions, you can use the Q&A component of Zoom to ask questions as we go along. You are also encouraged and welcome to raise your hand as we go, so that if you have any questions, I can call on you. At the moment, everyone is muted so that we can go along without any interruptions and background noise. But if you have any questions at all, please feel free to raise your hand or to ask a question in the Q&A form. And without further ado, we'll get started. So today we are talking about managing trans employees from triage to celebration. And the reason I framed it that way is because more often than not, organizations and employers come to me usually when somebody has just come out as trans in the workplace and they're really not sure what to do, or because they have a number of trans people working in the workplace and they would really like to elevate their organizational capacity and culture to be a place where trans people are celebrated in the workplace, and not just tolerated, not just included, but actually celebrated. And it runs the gamut. I get calls from people from every step along that way. And so I want to meet people where they are and offer some ideas about what you can do in anywhere you are on that spectrum. So in this webinar series, we started with best practices. Today, we're going to be talking about managing trans employees. And then next week, we're going to be focusing more on the bottom line and the big picture of how inclusion and diversity efforts around LGBTQ people in the workplace can actually translate into dollar signs for your organization or your company. So let's jump in. Why are we talking about this? It's 2019. We've come a long way in recent decades, particularly in the last decade, as far as trans visibility goes. So why are we still talking about this issue? Well, we're still talking about this issue because it's still a problem. Trans people, by and large, are still experiencing disproportionate and gross amounts of discrimination, harassment, and violence in the workplace. According to the most helpful report of its kind and survey of its kind, which covered over almost 28,000 trans people across the country in 2015, it gave us the US Trans Survey in 2015 gave us a really clear picture of what it is trans people are experiencing in the workplace on a regular basis. Just to give you a taste of some of the things that that report found, trans people experience 3 times higher rates of unemployment and underemployment than the general US population. That is 15% of trans people versus 5% of the general population. And these numbers break down even more so disproportionately higher among trans women and trans people of color. Additionally, 1 in 10 trans people have lost their job in their lifetime due to their gender identity or gender expression, which is an extraordinary number of people compared to the general US population. 1 in 5, specifically 20%, were fired, denied promotion, or not hired in the previous year prior to this survey. So in thinking about how many people you know in your life and how many of us all need jobs and all of us need some sort of gainful employment, To think that 1 out of 5 people in your close circle may not be able to get a job because of who they are, strictly because of their gender identity or gender expression or trans status, is really devastating. In addition, 16% who had a job in the year prior to the survey were verbally harassed, physically attacked, or sexually assaulted in the workplace. I have to tell you, in my work as an attorney, as a civil rights attorney in upstate New York, the vast majority of trans people that come to me about employment discrimination come to me with experiences like this. Most of my clients experience this sort of thing, where they come to work and they are called epithets and slurs. They're intentionally and maliciously misgendered, or the wrong pronouns are used for them. They're maliciously and intentionally dead named, which means that their given name or birth name is used in place of their preferred name. They're physically attacked, assaulted either bodily or with other objects, having things fall on them, having sort of traps set up so that if they walk around a corner, they'll hurt themselves in some way, and also experiencing sexual assault and harassment as well. This is very common in the workplace for trans people, especially when the general population sees trans people as an objectified thing and our bodies as objectified things. And so there's this a sense of entitlement by non-transgender people sometimes in the workplace that it's okay to talk about, speak about, or touch a trans person's body in ways that are grossly inappropriate and actually harassing and violent. So this is a fairly common thing. And then also thinking about how 3 in 4, so actually it was like 77%, of trans people who responded to the survey, 3 out of 4 took steps to avoid mistreatment, which included hiding or delaying their gender transition from their employers or quitting their job to avoid having to come out at work altogether. And if you can imagine this in our workplaces today, the evolution of workplaces is one that's come from, kind of leave the personal at home, come to work, do your job and go home, which was something that we experienced in the industrial age. And then it shifted as women actually came into the workforce in larger numbers in the mid 1900s. We saw more of the sense of, no, the workplace is more like a family. We want you to feel at home here. Consider this your second family. To more recently, this culture of we want you to bring your whole self to work, and that's kind of gone hand in hand with this idea of around diversity and inclusion and equity in the workplace. We want everyone to bring their whole selves to the workplace. The truth is, though, those sort of cultural shifts, the way that organizations approach how they want to share their work culture and workplace culture with their employees, and what kind of culture that will be, is shaped largely by the people who are in charge of it, which by and large are not trans people, which we'll talk about later as far as leadership positions and opportunities go. But when we have a workplace culture that says, bring your whole self to work, or we're a family here, the truth is, all of that is also still reflecting a lot of the gross inequities that we experience in our society, which don't actually value difference, that don't value diversity, that don't value a variety of different perspectives and lived experiences that people bring to the workplace. So when we say bring your whole self to work, are we actually making the workplace something conducive for people to do that safely and in a way that they know that they'll be respected and honored and valued, and even uplifted for doing so? And the truth is, I think by looking at this number that we have here and all the other numbers we just talked about, people don't feel that way. Trans people still feel very unsafe coming out in the workplace. They know that when they do, their job is on the line, their housing security is on the line, possibly their family and community support systems are on the line, their access to healthcare is on the line, the ability to just navigate public spaces safely and respectfully is on the line by coming out. And that part of it has not shifted yet. And if you are someone who is here on this webinar because you want to learn how to make your workplace safe and affirming and welcoming and even celebratory of trans people, you have to understand that this is where people are coming from. There's an expectation that when you go to work, if you start a job or you transition on the job as a trans person, that the expectation is that it's not going to go well. There's an expectation that it's going to go poorly, that you're going to experience this kind of discrimination or this kind of harassment or this kind of abuse or violence, and that you're not going to be able to bring your whole self to work. And if you do, the chances are good you're going to be punished for it. or at least you're going to be made to feel like that is the only part of you that's valued, and that the whole you, all the things that you bring to the table are not going to be seen or valued for what they are. So if you're joining us for this webinar today because you want to learn how to address these things, recognizing that that is what people are bringing to the door when they're approaching any sort of job, that sort of hesitation and anticipation for things to go poorly. As the employer, as the manager, as the supervisor, you have to start thinking about what can we do to shift that narrative within our own workplace, but also across the board in the industries that we're in, and in the US workforce more generally, right? So bearing that in mind, I want us to talk a little bit more about some of the other pieces of this, because you might be thinking to yourself, well, Milo, this is all well and good, but there are laws to protect against things like this, right? Like people can't experience this kind of harassment and discrimination in the workplace without, some sort of legal remedy available. And to that, you're right to some extent. And so let's talk about those things now. One would be looking at the federal level and the federal laws that are available. We do have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which applies to employers that have 15 or more employees. So it definitely does not cover a lot of small employers across the country. You have to have 15 or more employees for the law to apply to you. And technically speaking, the Title VII says prohibits discrimination based on sex, including sexual harassment and discrimination. But since 1989, there have been a number of court cases, including Supreme Court cases, that have consistently interpreted sex to include things like sex stereotyping, which open the door to understanding that when we discriminate against somebody or harass somebody based on what our expectations of what gender or sex or gender identity or expression that they should have, what it means to be male, what it means to be female or feminine or masculine, and our expectations of those, and whether or not people live up to those expectations and fit those roles that we've ascribed for them. The Supreme Court and many other courts have acknowledged that that is a form of sex discrimination under Title VII. So going back as far as 1989, we have really strong case law that indicates that trans people and gender nonconforming people are covered under Title VII. It's actually only recently, in recent years, that sexual orientation has sort of folded itself into the sex discrimination interpretation as well, in definition, with the idea that, let's say somebody discriminates against somebody because of they're perceived to be, or they're actually gay. Let's say they're a gay male. The argument would say that they are experiencing discrimination as a gay male because they did not live up to the sex stereotype of men being heterosexual or in relationships with women. And so therefore they are experiencing sex discrimination based on sex stereotyping and sexual orientation. As you probably know, or if you don't, you should know, there's actually several cases currently before the Supreme Court that are kind of hanging all of this in the balance about whether or not sex discrimination will be interpreted as including transgender, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and other folks based on sexual orientation or gender identity and expression in the future. Just this past month, there were oral arguments before the Supreme Court to debate this very issue, and it's something that we expect to see a decision hopefully within the next year. But it really does call into question the security of the law as interpreted, as opposed to having legislation that's particularly clear. The good news is, for a lot of the country, in all of the country, we all have to follow the federal law. It kind of creates a floor, foundation of everything that we have to comply with. This goes without saying for any state or US territory. But a lot of states have taken it upon themselves to more concretely solidify some protections for people that are not especially clear or solid on the federal level. These are just some examples because these are places that I have lived. So I grew up in Texas and I spent some time in Ohio and now live in New York. But these are good examples of states that kind of hang out at the federal floor and haven't really elevated their protections that are available for people based on a number of different historically marginalized statuses, whereas New York has specifically done so. And the list of protected statuses is actually quite long and quite extensive. In addition to state law, there can also be local ordinances from cities, towns, counties that can echo these efforts on the state level, or in states that don't have explicit protections, like in, for example, Texas or Ohio, a county or a town has the option of creating local ordinances that protect these statuses as well. So the rule here is that you can always build on the federal floor, but you can't chip away from it, right? And a lot of states and local ordinances have chosen to do that. Just as an example, in New York State, we have the human rights law, which protects against discrimination, harassment, and sexual harassment based on a whole bunch of statuses, including sex, sexual orientation, and very recently added gender identity and gender expression, as well as disability, which in New York has been interpreted to include gender dysphoria, which is the diagnosis that trans people usually need to get in order to access transition-related healthcare. And in New York, anyway, the human rights law applies to employers with 4 or more employees. So it covers a lot more employees than the federal law does. But of course, not all states have these laws. In fact, relatively few do. So across the country, there are 21 states and the District of Columbia that have laws on the books that particularly specifically protect people based on their actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And there's one state, I believe it's Wisconsin, that protects based on sexual orientation only. The vast majority of states do not have any protections on the books, though there might be some case law that applies in those states. So for a lot of the country, we're depending on the federal level to think about baseline requirements and compliance so that people are protected under the law. But of course, for anybody here who is familiar with how these things work, and I imagine a lot of you are, these laws tend to be more responsive than they are proactive, right? Sometimes they serve as a deterrent. They, tell an employer, well, this is the baseline requirement you have to follow in order to avoid any liability and lawsuits and things like that and bad press. But they're very rarely proactive, saying what it is that they have to do to make workplaces welcoming and affirming, right? Just what not to do. And sometimes even that's pretty broad and vague. So thinking about how can we take the real lived experiences of trans people in the workplace, pair it with the limitations that are available on the legal level as far as being offering remedies after the fact, assuming that you know what your rights are, you have rights available, you know what they are, and you have the privilege and the resources to exercise them, which not everybody does. That's all well and good, but what can we do to equip employers to proactively put things in place so that these sort of issues don't arise to begin with, right? And that's what we're actually going to talk about today. So before I move on, are there any questions yet? I'm just checking. I don't see any questions posed. Feel free to use the Q&A component. If you do have any questions, I'll keep checking it periodically. But otherwise, we can just keep moving forward. So what I want to do today is just pose a handful of things that you as employers and workplaces can do to make your work environment and your workplace culture more welcoming, affirming, and actually celebratory of transgender, gender expansive, and gender nonconforming people. And we could spend hours talking about this. And in fact, that's what I do for most of my work. So if you'd like to have a longer conversation about any of these things, let me know. But I just want to provide you with a few things to get you started in case it can get you on your way with some low-hanging fruit. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are names and pronouns. We're also going to talk about personnel policies, health insurance, and pipelines to leadership. So these are the 4 big categories that I would start with. And of course, there's always more you can go into to go a little deeper and a little broader in your commitment to anti-oppression work to celebrate trans employees in the workplace. But if you're just starting out, or even if you're somewhere far along, these are good places to start and to make sure these boxes are checked before you go deeper into the work. So let's start with names and pronouns. So the reason we're doing this, and we talked about this in the last session too, is that not all trans people are able to obtain legal name changes or want to obtain legal name changes. And in fact, when a person first comes out as trans, it may be a while before they go through that legal or judicial process to change their name. So very often, though not always, trans people will use a preferred name over their legal name or given name, and they will also change their pronouns, which are not necessarily don't necessarily stem from identity documents anyway. That's just the pronouns that you use. It's a person's personal pronouns. So um, thinking about ways that you can craft your organization and your paperwork and your processes and your databases and things to account for more than one name that a person might need to be known by for a variety of reasons, and also how to support people in utilizing the pronouns that are correct for them. So just some considerations. First thing I would do is really take a look at your applications and also your intake forms. So as far as hiring applications go, a lot of people use sort of forms that they've copied and pasted from other people or from models that they found on the internet. And often these application forms do not provide spaces for previous names or names that a person would prefer to be known by. And I think that this is really important. It sets a signal to somebody who's applying for a job at your organization that if you took the time to make space for a legal name, which you might need to know for reasons for Social Security or for background checks, things like that, that's all well and good, but to actually take the time to create a space for a preferred name and to put in place a process and a protocol for anybody who's dealing with the hiring process to look at that name and to only use that name when referring to the candidate. That's hugely important. That's a part that is often missed. Sometimes we put these systems in place to capture information, but we never bother looking at it. And that defeats the purpose. And it also, that failure to follow up to put, to walk the walk and not just talk the talk, sets a signal to people that you're not really serious about this. But if you create space on your applications for hiring and also on your intake forms for new clients or customers or patients, whatever area and industry that you're in, and then take it seriously to only refer to people by the names that they put down as preferred, it's a huge step toward equity for people who may or may not have access or want to legally change their name, but need to be referred to as the name that they actually go by. This goes also with personnel files, thinking about who needs to know a person's given or legal name if it's different from their preferred name. More often than not, a trans person coming to a place of employment who has not legally changed their name will be very protective of who knows their given name or birth name. Sometimes within this community, that name is referred to even as a dead name, which is a name that is dead to them, no longer used. And hearing that name called out to them, being referred to by that name, is an extraordinarily painful thing for a trans person to experience. Not just embarrassing, not just disrespectful, but actually painful. Because it's something that it's very dehumanizing. It's something that says that you don't really care to know who it is that I am or respect who it is that I am as a person. And you're bringing up this name that refers to somebody who is not here, who doesn't exist. And so thinking about how you can fashion your personnel files and create a policy or a protocol for need to know information of who actually has access to that name and when it actually needs to be used, if ever, for formal paperwork. Also thinking about name tags and nameplates. A lot of organizations say, well, we can't possibly put your preferred name on your name tag for legal reasons, and or the nameplate on your desk or on your office door. We need to know your quote unquote real name for legal reasons. And that's simply not true. People use nicknames and preferred names all the time on name tags and on nameplates without any sort of issue. And there would not be any issue for a trans person to use the preferred name that they use in those spaces as well. The only reason an employer would ever need to utilize a legal name if it's different is for taxes, for paychecks, for payroll, for that sort of thing, for insurance maybe. But that's about it. Everything else can certainly be in an alias or a nickname or a preferred name without any issue. And I would also say that if you are an organization that really does feel firmly about trans people not being able to use their preferred name, that same rule needs to be applied to every single person, and nobody could use a nickname at all, or go by their middle name, or go by any other sort of name in the workplace. And I guarantee you that other people would be pretty upset by it as well. So make sure that you're equitably applying your policies, even if they are unspoken or unwritten policies across the board. Thinking about email accounts too, this is something that often comes up. Somebody starts working at your organization, and some IT person unwittingly creates an email account with the given name or legal name of the person without someone communicating to them that it's the preferred name that should be used, and that it's okay to put the preferred name as the email account. So making sure that there's a policy and a process for all of that, as well as encouraging people to use the name that they go by in their email signature. This is also a great opportunity for people to use pronouns as a form of advocacy. So a lot of trans people, in an effort to remind their coworkers and remind their customers and their colleagues and their networks of the pronouns that they use, will add pronouns to their email signatures. But I would argue that this is actually an incredible tool that all people can utilize in order to be allies to the trans community. So if you are a non-transgender person, if you're a cisgender person, advocating for your organization to support and encourage as many coworkers and employees as possible to start using pronouns in their signature takes the weight and the responsibility off the trans person and the focus off the trans person and their pronouns, right? So now, because it tells you that you shouldn't assume anyone's pronouns, that it's best if it comes from that individual person, how they identify. So now if I get emails from my colleagues and 9 out of 10 of my colleagues have added pronouns to their email signatures, I'm not looking at that as a sign that any one of them might be a trans person and ascribing any of the sort of stigmas and implicit biases that I might have against trans people in so doing. I see that everybody is doing it, and that it normalizes that, that aspect of sharing that part of ourselves to our colleagues and coworkers and to our clients as well. I have to tell you, as somebody who works with LGBTQ people in my legal practice, it's also an incredible symbol and signal to potential clients that I am a person who does not take pronouns as for granted, right? That I understand that not everybody's pronouns are readily apparent, and that I don't want to assume people's pronouns by putting my own pronouns in my signature. So it's a signal to people who I might be working with that I'm someone who understands, that I'm someone who has taken the time and the energy to put that signal out there, in the same way that some people put rainbow stickers on the windows of their doors, or the windows by the doors, so that people see them as they walk through the door and they know that that's a place that's safe for LGBTQ people. That same sort of feeling of being seen and being safe comes from seeing pronouns in people's signatures. It's just a true fact, and it's free. So that's nice, right? Everybody likes free things. Similarly, adding these things to business cards, making sure that people are able to put their preferred name, and also, if they choose, their pronouns on their business cards, and encouraging all of your staff to do that. And also getting in the practice of using pronouns in all of your introductions, as part of any staff meetings or practice group meetings or policy development meetings or whatever kind of meetings that you have in the workplace. If you were going around to make introductions with names and roles and favorite ice cream flavors and other things that you want to break the ice, encouraging people to share their pronouns if they feel comfortable doing so can be also an extraordinary way to lend an olive branch to the people in the room whose pronouns may not be readily apparent, right? And that way you don't have to put this emphasis or pressure on the 1 or 2 trans people in the room who will feel the need to out themselves and share their pronouns, because everybody will be sharing their pronouns, and it makes it a safe space for everyone. And then finally, thinking about other ways to support trans people in terms of accessing pronouns on a regular basis. How can we make sure that people's pronouns are readily apparent and available, not just in email signatures or business cards, which are only apparent when you get an email or somebody hands you a business card, but maybe part of our uniforms or part of what we interact with our customers or our clients. I work with a lot of organizations that are customer service based, right? And a lot of what they deal with are their employees who are working with customers at cash registers or at coffee shops, one-on-one sort of interactions, and customers not readily knowing a person's pronouns or using the wrong pronouns for them. And there's that tension between, well, this is customer service and customers are always right and we want to support customers, but we also need to support our employees in being able to express themselves and say what it is their pronouns are. A great way to do this is if you use name tags in your workplace to add stickers or some other way of adding pronouns to the name tags themselves. Investing in some inexpensive but fun pins as pictured here, that not only you would encourage all of your employees to utilize if you want, but also you can make them freely available to customers. It could be a pin that just says respect pronouns or ask me about my pronouns. And it could be in a bucket that customers can grab whatever pronouns they want to use too. And it can be part of a conversation and part of something that everyone feels engaged with throughout their work. We found this to be a really exceptionally useful way and also inexpensive way for people to feel seen and feel validated in the workplace without causing a lot of hoopla. All right. No questions yet, so we're going to move on, unless anybody wants to throw a question out there real quick. Okay, so let's talk about personnel policies. So the first thing I want to say about personnel policies is that when we're thinking about HR policies, about employee handbooks, things like that, you could take we could take hours and days pouring through it together and talking about different ways to make them more equitable and inclusive of all people, especially historically marginalized people. The vast majority of personnel policies at most places of employment are copied and pasted boilerplate language that they've inherited from other companies that inherited them from other companies that inherited them from other companies, going back years and years and years. More often than not, I'm sure most of you know, either no one ever reads them, or they don't make a lot of sense, or they're not really applicable to this day and age in your actual workplace culture, or they're actually contradictory. That's my favorite. Or they're written in such a way that is not very conducive for people to engage with them or actually use them, right? And so thinking about when you're engaging with your personnel policies, and maybe jumping in with some of the things I'm about to mention, think about the framework that you're using when you approach these policies and how you want to, what your goal is when you want to shape them. Something I think is really important is thinking about the distinction between using an anti-oppression approach versus sort of a passive non-oppression approach, right? So here's what I'm going to tell you. Personnel policies typically are written to maintain the status quo at an organization, right? Whatever that might be, whatever the culture is, whatever the policies and practices and protocols are, personnel policies usually materially and formally memorialize these things in writing in some way. What we also know is that the status quo in an organization inevitably reflects the status quo in our society. And our society is inequitable, right? Our society is built in a way that privileges some people over others, just based on who they are, right? We know that we live in a society that is inherently racist, that is inherently sexist, ableist, classist, ageist, right? Cissexist, which means that we support and encourage and benefit cisgender people over transgender people, right? All of these different things. And our organizations, even the really well-meaning ones, are not immune from having that same sort of dynamic within the walls of our work. And when we think about our personnel policies and how they might maintain the status quo, we have to really think about, how is it that they might be passively taking a non-oppression approach, which is to say, well, they're not on their face causing harm. They're not saying, well, we're going to treat women differently than men, or we're going to treat disabled people differently than able-bodied people, or we're going to treat Black people differently from white people. They may not say that in actual words in the policies, but these policies are written in such a way that often will either imply that or have the impact, an adverse impact that actually causes that sort of disparity to occur. So when you're thinking about your policies, it's important to take a really good look and ask why it is that we have the policies that we have. What is it that they're actually saying? What is it they're supposed to be saying? Are they accessible? Is it possible that there's going to be a disproportionately adverse impact on some people more than others? And how can we address that to bridge the equity gap in these policies, right? And for me, that's taking the anti-oppression approach. That's saying that we're not going to just sit by and say, well, this seems like a neutral policy on its face, and that's fine. Because that's turning a blind eye to the harm that can be caused by the fact that this policy has not been viewed through an anti-oppression lens. So instead, I encourage you to take the time and energy to actually look very closely at these policies and think about the gaps in equity that might occur because of them, okay? So that being said, here are some policies that I want to share with you that you can think about how to approach them in your work. So thinking about hiring and retention and promotions, right? There will be, some people don't actually have written policies about these things, particularly around hiring, but I think it's really important to consider how it is that you approach hiring on a systemic level and how it's working to break down inequity in the workplace, especially when we think about how trans and gender nonconforming people are grossly more likely to be turned away from job opportunities just because of their gender identity and gender expression, right? So how can we approach hiring in a way that will bridge that equity gap? Well, one way of doing that is thinking about formalizing a requirement that anybody who participates in the hiring process, any HR person, any hiring team members, all have to go through implicit bias training. That's one. Also have to go through one or more cultural humility trainings of some kind. And not just go through trainings, but also make a conversation around implicit bias part of the process itself, to start and end every interview with a conversation around, okay, let's be mindful about implicit bias. Let's talk about how these things are playing out in the way that we're approaching this interview with this person. Thinking about how you can streamline or make more uniform the questions that you ask to decrease implicit bias. And also thinking about the way that you write job descriptions and how equity is written into job descriptions. How are you communicating to people how that you want to strongly encourage people of historically marginalized identities to apply for these jobs, and why that's important to you? How do you share your values and your mission in your organization about equity and diversity in the workplace, in your job descriptions, let alone the hiring process? Thinking about retention, people who have historically marginalized identities and statuses are less likely to stay at organizations for a long period of time due to the lack of inclusivity in the workplace and affirmation in the workplace. There's a high turnover rate in the legal profession, for example, of attorneys of color, both men and women, and even higher among women of color at small, medium, and large-sized firms, as well as nonprofit organizations. And you have to think about, why is it that, you know, if we've checked off boxes that we have a diverse workforce, why is it that people are not staying? And thinking about how your workplace is actually inclusive and equitable so that people want to stay and want to grow and want to make a career at your place of employment. And thinking about promotion opportunities, and if you have policies about how people can advance in your organization, how are those policies accessible to people? Are they equitable? Are they accounting for the different kinds of experience and perspectives people might be bringing to the table? Or are they very, very narrowly construed to really actually only promote certain kinds of people who have certain advantages or privileges that others might not have? Are your promotion standards and processes being applied universally? Is everybody getting access to them, or is it only people who have sort of informal mentorships with people with power and authority? Thinking about all of these things and how to make them more accessible and affirming to everyone, I think is really important. I see here that there's a quick chat. I'm just going to see. Oh, thank you for asking, Whitney. So Whitney asked us, what is cultural humility? So cultural humility is, I think, a preferred term over the idea of cultural competency. So we often hear about cultural competency in terms of, well, I went to a 3-hour LGBTQ cultural competency workshop, and now I know everything there is. I am competent in LGBTQ cultural issues, right? Well, the idea that after only, sometimes shorter workshop, like a 30-minute workshop or an hour or even 3 hours, that any of us would be competent culturally about anything that is not like us, that is outside of our own personal experiences and the experiences of our most immediate communities is really, well, it's laughable. It's not true, right? And what it tends to do just by using the term competent, it gives us this out that we've done enough, that we've attended that workshop, so I can check that off for the next year or next 5 years, or maybe for the rest of my career, because I'm good, I'm competent. Instead, framing it as cultural humility provides us with an opportunity to understand that there's a lot we need to learn, and there's a lot that we have left to learn even after a single workshop or a dozen workshops. That the world is much bigger and more richly diverse and beautiful than just our very limited experiences in it. And approaching that with a sense of humility, I think, is really important. So I'm a big fan of calling it cultural humility instead of cultural competency, and I would encourage you all to do the same. Thank you, Whitney, for asking. Um, okay, so thinking about dress codes too. So a lot of organizations have a fairly, what you might call, facially neutral dress code, where they don't actually say what it is men can wear or what it is that women can wear, people who would identify as men or as women, right? But even without that specific explicit sexed language, if you read your dress codes, the general theme is that the only mention of grooming standards, of clothing requirements, of lengths of clothes or kinds of shirts or blouses, of kinds of shoes, things like that, all have to do with women or feminine of center people, right? Which is to say that there's usually no mention whatsoever of masculine attire, because masculine is considered, without saying so, the default and the okay. And anything that strays further and further away from what would be acceptable masculine attire is going to become less and less acceptable. So thinking about the way that even in our dress codes, even if they don't explicitly say men or women, they are still inherently sexist, and how that might even further impact people who are transgender, who are gender nonconforming, or gender expansive, or non-binary, or androgynous in some way. How it is that we're applying these standards across the board? Are we evenly enforcing them to all people in the workplace, or only certain people, or some people bearing the brunt of dress code violations more than others? And how can we make them more equitable and inclusive of all people and all different gender expressions, right? So that's something to think about. Of course, access to appropriate restrooms. I'm not going to linger on this because I don't want to talk about trans people in restrooms very much, but it should go without saying that every person in your workplace should be able to access a restroom that is appropriate for them to use, period. So if you are a workplace that does not have a single stall gender neutral option, available for all people to use, including people for whom a male restroom or a female restroom may not be the most appropriate for them. For example, a non-binary person or an intersex person may not feel comfortable, or actually a lot of people may not feel comfortable using multi-stall restrooms, right? How is it that you can make sure that there are restrooms available for all people to safely and comfortably use? The other piece of that, though, is not just making a policy where people can, you say people should use restrooms that are appropriate to them, but also backing them up when they do. Because what typically happens is that this policy is all well and good until one person says that they are uncomfortable using a restroom, usually with a transgender person or somebody that they perceive to be trans or gender nonconforming in some way, and they complain about it. Well, then the question becomes, what are you as the employer going to do? Are you going to support and enforce that policy that everyone is able to use the one that is comfortable for them? Or are you going to back down because of one person's discomfort? Well, recognizing that the vast majority of employers that get this wrong have a tendency to send the trans person or the gender nonconforming person to some obscure restroom somewhere else because they have made someone uncomfortable. And I'm talking about sending them to a different floor or down to the basement to the mop bucket room where there also happens to be a toilet. It's an unacceptable approach. It's not the way that it needs to be gone about. So if you do have somebody else, another coworker in the workplace who expresses discomfort using restrooms with trans people, they can be directed to alternative restrooms that they would be more comfortable using if they need to, because that is the organization's value, is that everyone should be able to access appropriate restrooms safely. Thinking about leave options as well. So something to consider, and we'll talk about health insurance policies and things in just a second, but making sure that there are leave policies available so that if a trans person needs to take time off of work for transition-related healthcare, surgeries or fertility issues and things like that, that there is something available for people to do that. Also looking at just generally for gender equity, looking at your parental leave options to make sure that any parent, regardless of sex or gender identity, is able to take the same kind of parental leave is really important. But thinking of just the different kinds of leave people might need to take in order to access the services that they need, right? Um, Actually, in the past year, I've gotten several calls from individuals who worked for employers who had equitable health insurance policies that actually covered the kind of care that they needed. And again, we'll talk about that in just a second. But when they tried to take time off from work to actually go receive that care, they experienced discrimination and often were fired almost immediately after taking leave, even if they had everything in place to be able to get that leave, and you know, for doctor's letters and things like that. So making sure that at the outset there's something in the policy that makes it clear that you acknowledge that that might be something that trans people might need, and that you are willing to make those sort of accommodations to make sure they are able to access the healthcare that they need. Also, updating your non-discrimination and non-harassment policies to be inclusive of gender identity and gender expression, transgender status, and also possibly gender dysphoria as a form of disability, and making it accessible so people can actually read it and understand it and know what their rights are. And then kind of a related piece is also making sure that if somebody files a grievance, if they file a complaint, that the investigation process itself is trauma informed. You know, something I hear about a lot are trans people who file complaints with their employers because they are consistently misgendered, or they've been sexually assaulted in the workplace, or somebody is calling them epithets and slurs that are transphobic and homophobic. And then the investigation that ensues actually finds a way to turn things around and make it so that it sounds like the trans person is the person at fault, that they brought this upon themselves, that they were actually, you know, quote unquote aggressive or combative or rude in some way, when really it was a response to the aggression and the violence that they were experiencing from their colleagues to begin with. And if the investigation process itself were more trauma informed from the outset, if the people who were conducting the investigation were trained in trauma informed grievances and understood the lived experiences of trans people, I think the outcomes would be grossly different. And then finally, to finish off this section, thinking about transition teams. And this is a really, I think, cool way to affirmatively add something to your policy that is a nod to trans people who may or may not have come out yet in your workplace and would like to be able to come out, be their most authentic selves, and transition on the job, and know that their company is going to have their back. And nothing says that like an actual provision in your policies that says that we have transition teams in place, that there are people who would be assigned to the team for that individual trans person to make sure that things go smoothly as they come out and transition on the job. And those teams can look really different depending on your organization. Sometimes they include an HR person or someone else from the higher leadership. Often they include at least one or two people that the trans person themselves identifies as someone that they trust and they feel comfortable with. And these folks work together to make sure that, you know, the road is paved for things to go smoothly, that there is a uniform communication about a person's transition and coming out, their preferred names and pronouns, sort of like a rallying team to just smooth out the edges and make sure that things go smoothly. Like we said at the outset, most trans people approach coming out at work as a really terrifying prospect where they know that things are going to go poorly. So how can you proactively put something in place to communicate to people that not only are things going to go well, but we're going to have your back every step along the way, and here's what this looks like. It's a really radical, sort of revolutionary act as employers, but it's also something that is extraordinarily inexpensive and actually makes a huge impact for people in the long run. Okay, pausing for questions. I don't see any, so we'll just keep going. We have about 8 minutes left, so I want to touch on these last pieces here. So in terms of health insurance, we also see a lot of insurance policies have boilerplate language that has been passed down from decade to decade that explicitly excludes and categorically excludes transition-related care. So even if your company offers a policy that does cover transition-related care for people, you may also have an exclusion in the exclusions part. So take the time to take a look and see if the exclusion is still there. It will often be in the same area as like cosmetic surgery, things like that. And it may say something like, you know, sex change surgeries, sex reassignment, or my favorite is sex transformation surgeries, which makes me feel like trans people are, you know, butterflies stuck in a cocoon and not allowed to transform. So check to make sure you remove the exclusions, but also in thinking about how to cover transition-related care, you know, make sure that the policy that you negotiate with the insurance company is one that minimizes gatekeeping. And by that, I mean, a lot of these policies kind of take the minimum standards that are recommended by the experts in this work, the American Medical Association, the World Professional Association for Trans Health, also known as WPATH, et cetera, and they add a bunch of unnecessary requirements to it just to make it onerous, just to make it harder for people to access care. So be sure to go with the standards that are actually set, the contemporary standards by experts in the field. Also try to combat sexism in coverage. So a lot of these policies will cover most things that trans men like myself might need, like hormone therapy, like testosterone, and surgeries such as top surgery and a variety of different surgeries to bring a trans man's body into alignment with who he is and his gender identity. But the vast majority of procedures that a trans woman might need, somebody who's transitioning from someone assigned male at birth to female to woman, a lot of these things are categorically excluded in a coverage policy as cosmetic. And not only is this absolutely untrue, but it is grossly discriminatory and it's really sexist if you think about it. So looking at your policy and making sure that both trans men, trans women, and non-binary people are able to access whatever care it is that they might need in order to bring their bodies into alignment with their gender identity and to treat their gender dysphoria. So be sure to review those carefully. And then finally, I'd say, look and make sure that fertility treatments are covered for trans people. There is an overriding thought among our society that trans people cannot or should not be able to reproduce. A lot of states have actually memorialized this in their laws. Texas is one of them. So I talked about this, I think, a little bit last week, but in order for somebody to change their Texas birth certificate, they have to get a court-ordered sex change, which declares that they're sufficiently no longer male enough or female enough. And what they're really looking for there is to make sure that a trans person is sterilized, that they're infertile, that they're no longer able to reproduce. So in order for me to change my Texas birth certificate, among most states in the country, I would have to get a court order that declares that I am infertile and sterile, right? This is grossly problematic from a reproductive justice standpoint. And most insurance companies, even if they cover fertility treatments for cisgender people for a variety of different conditions, will not cover fertility treatments or fertility measures for trans people whatsoever. It's categorically excluded. So be sure to check that out and see if there's anything you can do to remove those kind of barriers for trans people. And then finally, just to round us out here, we're going to talk about pipelines to leadership. So what I can tell you is this. I can count on one hand the number of out trans judges there are in the entire country. And I'm talking about all the different kinds of judges, administrative law judges, judges that are elected, judges that are appointed, all across the board. On one hand, I can count the number of out trans judges. I can also count on one hand the number of out trans CEOs and executives who are not in charge of organizations that are specifically trans focused, which is to say that there are a lot of trans people out in the world with extraordinary leadership capacity and capability who are not currently acting in positions of leadership. And I don't think it's because of their lack of ability. I think it's often a lack of recognition by employers that trans people are not only capable, but also valued and would bring an extraordinary perspective to the work. And it's also from a lack of explicitly making it clear that you were searching for that in part of your executive search and headhunting process. So what I would say to this is, make it explicit. Put it out there that you are looking for trans leadership when you have a position that's open that you want to fill. Tell your executive search team that this is something that you want to center. There are plenty of trans people who could fill these roles and do an exceptional job, but are not given this sort of explicit chance. And due to the systemic discrimination that we have in this country and in this society, those chances usually don't come organically as a result. Also looking at equitable succession planning so that you are taking a really clear idea of the mentorship and leadership pipelines that you're setting in place for all employees in your organization, but specifically with an eye to maximizing opportunities for people who are historically marginalized, including trans people, so that the next generation of leadership in your organization is reflective of folks who otherwise would not have an equitable chance at those opportunities. Formalizing mentorship programs. So a lot of organizations have informal mentorship. It just so happens that you have the right supervisor or the right person down the hall from you who's willing to give you extra time, always has their door open, always hands you the good projects, always thinks of you when putting together a team, but not everybody equitably has access to those things, especially if we're usually looking for people who are most like us in those opportunities that we will most likely trust, right? So formalizing mentorship programs so that all people, including historically marginalized people, have access to those leadership opportunities. Committing significant resources to equity, inclusion, and diversity. And this can look like a lot of things. Like I said earlier, making sure all hiring teams go through implicit bias and cultural humility trainings. It could also include hiring a full-time position who is not an HR person who is in charge of inclusion and diversity efforts. It can look like a lot of different things. I'm trying to think as we run out of time. Also, employee resource groups that are specific to not only diversity and inclusion, but LGBTQ communities specifically to provide recommendations and ways that the organization can improve on this front. But there has to be an actual commitment and actual resources poured into this work. And then finally, developing and rewarding anti-oppression leadership. This is huge. When we have somebody who's in a meeting who interrupts the meeting to express concern over something that was said that was racist or transphobic, more often than not, the folks in the room will see that person as a rabble rouser, as somebody who is just going to interrupt things and cause trouble and slow things down. And that person may not be invited to the next meeting. That's just how our organizations go. Like I said, we have a tendency to perpetuate the status quo, right? So how can we turn that on its head? How can we find those people who are willing to interrupt bias when they see it and they hear it, who are willing to push a little discomfort in order to make positive change in your work culture? And how can we reward that with opportunities, with leadership development, with leadership growth and positions? So thinking about how to intentionally do that and how to formalize that in your workplace. All right, so those are just some ideas to get you started. Again, today we were talking about managing trans employees. Next week, we're going to talk about the bottom line and how we can turn diversity and inclusion efforts of LGBTQ people into dollar signs for your organization. It is 12 o'clock, or 1 o'clock, so I'm going to let you go. Thank you all for coming, and hopefully I'll see you next week.